that's the peer review itself. So you also helped me quite a lot because you covered in the introduction a little bit about me. So I'll just skip through these slides, but I was born in Split in Croatia. I did my MD and my PhD in medical ethics, which focused on the integrity of biomedical publications. I was very lucky to have editors who were to have mentors who were editors of a medical journal. And so they sort of introduced me very early on in the works of journal and on peer review. And it's because of them and the peer review project in Europe, which is a Europe cost project that analyzed peer review, that I got to sort of research peer review for now already 6-7 years and to really fall in love with everything peer review related and peer review research. And I've been at Stanford University since 2020, first as a postdoc and now as an associate director of SPORR, which is the program on rigor and reproducibility. For full transparency, I put here sort of a little bit of metrics about me, including the number of publications, citations, and the number of reviews that I produced. Just this year, I rejected more than 40 reviews for journals, and I peer-reviewed around 15 articles, I think, this year alone. And if you share your review reports with what used to be Publons or today Clarivate because they bought them, then it sort of compares your, at least on some very basic statistics like the number of words, your peer review reports to all of the peer review reports that they have in their database. And so if you look at this, you kind of don't want me as a reviewer, but it seems that my review reports are almost as double of length of the average peer review reports, which are somewhere around 380 words. But the University of Amsterdam, where I did my postdoc, as Leanne mentioned, actually seems to write one of the longest peer reviews in all the world. So maybe that's where I come from a little bit of influence from the Dutch academia, which is, as you can see, longer than the University of Split, where I started, or even now Stanford Medicine. It seems that their peer reviews are a little bit shorter. And I'm not in any way equating that the quality of peer review is proportional to the number of words, but it is sort of indicative of how many different things we touch upon when we produce review reports. I was an editor-in-chief of a journal on research integrity and peer review, which we often call RIPR, all up to the April of this year, so almost full 6 years. And during that time, because we publish around 15 to 20 articles a year, almost 140 submissions, of which more than a third we reject before peer review because they wouldn't fall into the scope of the journal itself or were opinion pieces. And I sort of made a decision when I was editor that I want the journal to focus exclusively on research in these two topics, because I felt that this field often has a lot of opinions of what people want, but less practical research. And then some other thing that I sort of introduced during that time was that I would provide full peer review report for the article before we decide to send it to external peer reviews, so that the authors would change and do all including the formatting that we wanted them, so that the reviewers already, when they received the article, knew sort of that this was very much more similar to other articles in our journal, both in structure and how we want them to be presented. And one of the best compliments you can ever get as an editor is that you get the little quote that I put down there, is that someone praises you for the depth and the quality of peer review that they receive for your journal. Of course, there have been opposites as well, where people were very unhappy because we would ask them, sort of do things, and there were authors that would, around 10% of authors would withdraw their submissions to the journal after they would see up my peer reviews because they thought we were asking too much, or they did not believe that they could make the changes that were asked. And I thought that was quite interesting. And the reason we did those peer reviews before inviting external peer reviews is because early on I saw that it can be very tricky when external reviewers ask for some things and then the editors ask for something completely different, and then they don't know, are you being bitchy, or where does this come from, because they didn't see those comments from the reviewers themselves. And I will talk about a little bit later about how much different reviewers disagree. But just a slow intro to all of this, I think you're aware that today we publish around more than 6 million articles per year, and we have around 100,000 active journals across all the globe. That's a big number of journals out there, and so the there's a huge variety of how peer review is done and the quality of peer review itself and where these journals are indexed. Often we talk about the journals that have an impact factor, but it's only around 22,000 journals that are indexed in Clarivate that give an impact factor. So there's a large number of journals that publish science that are not in that database and that don't get an impact factor. But when our journal started in 2016, we also didn't have impact factor all up to 2022. And I can tell you from personal experience that once a journal does receive an impact factor, no matter how flawed that metric is, that the number of submissions exponentially increases. Because impact factors are still being used for evaluation of scientists, and then it becomes important for, especially early career researchers, that their work is published in higher impact factor journals. And so when an author submits a paper to a journal, usually, in the journal submission system, they need to fill in the authors, the affiliation, the abstracts, a lot of declarations, and then attach their Word document or a LaTeX document, depending on which field you sort of work in, and maybe some appendices, tables of figures, or reporting guidelines checklists. In some journals, you also have to have a cover letter because there's no science proving that cover letters actually help. In our journal, we decided to ban cover letters because I didn't find them useful, and I realized that I wasn't reading them, and so I thought it wasn't really fair to ask someone to submit something when I'm not even looking at those. If the reviewers that get invited for papers only get to see an abstract to make a decision will they review it, then I wanted to make my decision also by checking your title and abstract and not being influenced in anything said by the cover letter. But of course, there are many journals out there that use cover letters. And as an editor, one of the first things you see is just based on the structure of the article that you get submitted, did the author who submit to you ever read any other article in your journal, because you already know based on the titles and the subtitles and sort of formatting and the references is how much effort they put in before they submitted it to you. And even though since the 1960s, the IMRAD structure, which we call Introduction, Methods, Results, and Discussion, have become the predominant structure of medical, especially biomedical articles. Empirical studies have shown that this structure greatly varies across journals. Some journals have a dedicated literature section, especially in social science research. They can have the methods at the end of the article, meaning first introduction and then results. If you look at Nature journals, they will have small articles that combine all of them in small research papers of less than 700 or 1,000 words. So there's a wide variation of how the article itself looks like and where and what expectations the different journals have on how both the titles and the tables and everything else should be structured. And I think this sometimes causes sort of pain for the authors because they can spend a lot of time formatting the article for the journal itself. And then the journal, when you submit it, makes some checks that happen often when we talk about peer review, but in some research, this is considered to be a part of peer review, at least editorial peer review, where you check the submission for the scope of the article, but also now, and I don't know if you have seen it, a week ago, the STM Integrity Hub, which is a collaboration of publishers, of many publishers around the world, have release these infographics of the checks that journals now do before even deciding to send your paper to peer review. Some of these checks check for duplicate publications or duplicate submissions. We want to avoid both of those because they give extra work both to journals and to the reviewers. They can check for plagiarism using Authenticate or similar software. They check for image duplication. They can check for AI-generated text. And they are developing checks for adherence to reporting guidelines, statistics, and other AI checks. Springer Nature has announced a new AI tool that they are testing on scientific reports that will check around 14 things of a manuscript before it even goes to peer review. And Verified Archive, which is the preprint server of Gates Foundation, is also announced 20 checks that they will be automatically sort of doing to manuscripts before it happened. And there is no consensus if this considered to be peer review as we know it traditionally, or is this sort of a new format of peer review. But one thing that they have also released that because of these checks, they are now detecting more than 1,000 paper mill detections. And for those of you who know a little bit about paper mills are organized processes of basically selling your authorship or ideas of a manuscript for money and submitting it to journals or adding authors to papers so that you can buy authorship for your career. And its current estimate, at least in 2024 and 2025, there were around 1.5% of all literature consists of such articles, where around almost 7,000 articles are already being retracted because of paper mill activities, which is both the manipulation because of paper mills and the peer review have been the highest retractions in science in the last 2 years because of fake peer reviews or AI-generated peer reviews. And some of the checks the journals maybe should be doing, and again, we don't have agreements of is this should be called peer review or not, is checking the ethical approval. There have been around 700 retractions of papers just because of misleading ethical information or authors saying that they have ethical review board approvals when they don't have them. One of the biggest examples recently is from the French team of Didier's, where they published more than 200 papers using the same ethical review board number that never did exist, and around 40 of these have now been retracted, and a lot of others are being investigated. And so what that tells us is that even though journalists have not been asking for copies of ethical review board, actual documents, that many journals are now asking that you have proof that it has been, and not just a statement, it has been with some things, but to show proof that this has been done. Similar for conflict of interest. Conflict of interest have been declared in all journals almost since the 90s. Almost all journals ask them to declare, but there has also never been really a paper that has been tracked solely for conflict of interest. They are always with other aspects that are wrong in the paper, like falsification or wrong data, things that come alongside of that. And there are many people who believe that if you do a properly reproducible manuscript with all data and code shared, that even if you do have a conflict of interest, that the study will be valid, and that the conflict of interest are maybe getting more attention that they actually deserve in the science itself. And one thing that what the journals often don't have the proper ability to check is the authors themselves. And there have been examples in the past when authors have used the names of their pets, of cats or dogs or hamsters that they put in the authorship list, or that they put the names of their mother-in-law or father-in-law or characters from books. And I think the most famous one of these examples was in 2012 when an author invented both the name and affiliation of a paper and generated a paper sort of using before that time some generation of text. And then he sent it to 304 open access journals, of which 50% of journals accepted. And the only reason why he did it was to show that if you don't have quality checks and even checking does the author of the institution exist, that things can happen. And we've seen that it's very hard, and the science isn't yet there. The whole scientific publishing is not very good at checking the existence of authors or that the affiliations that the authors list actually belong to them. ORCID IDs are today helping with this, but again, anyone can create their ORCID IDs, and you can even create ORCID IDs for people that have deceased. So there are, ORCID is now working on this authentication system where a university will verify that you actually work for them in a specific time and that you have affiliation with them before you can sort of do things. But these are the things that are sort of not being done great across journals these days. And the reason why I talk about authorship is that authorship in science is the most prevalent questionable research practice, where the gift authorship, giving authorship people who don't deserve, and the ghost authorship, removing people from the papers even though they deserve it, are extremely prevalent practices, of someone saying up to 50% of papers being affected by one of these two practices. And we have done a systematic review on this topic where we've really seen that it can even go to up to 50% depending on the question and the way you ask that question. But even when directly asking people, have they been approached by others? Around 10% of people in surveys admit that they've been approached by someone to put them on the paper when they don't deserve it, and 16% of people actually admitted doing so. But when you ask them, do you think that on your authorship list there are people who don't deserve it? Almost a quarter of people say that they think there are people who don't deserve it. And like institutions, journals are had a hard time of dealing with authorship disagreements, because it can take a very long time, and we are not supposed to be the judges. You're supposed to sort of trust that everything is being done in a good way. But that is where even most of the corrections, and corrections constitute around 5% of all published papers today, around 30% to 50% of all corrections deal with authorship affiliations, or adding or removing extra authors from the authorship list. And even though we have the ICMG guidelines already from 1987 or 2013, so we have the credit taxonomy, these things have sort of changed what journals ask, but we have seen that they haven't improved those things, because in many journals, any author will just click anything that the journal asks and say, we follow these guidelines, or we have done these roles. And yet the empirical analysis have shown that there are papers where everyone has that, all of the 14 roles of the credit taxonomy, everyone will click anything that sort of people say. And so this is sort of something that isn't great. And also we've seen, when we analyze the instructions to authors that journals publish, that only around a quarter of the journals mention anything about authorship or any rules about authorship. And when we analyze preprint servers for the same things, we found even less emphasis on what, who deserves and how authorship should be assigned. And the two practices that we've seen across publishing is the rise in the equal contributions of papers. So more than two authors being declared on a paper, usually with asterisks, that they have contributed equally. Again, this is because of often universities only value either the first or the last authorships of papers for your promotion. And we have seen a prevalence, and some institutions also value if you're a corresponding author or the one that anyone can contact about the paper. So we have seen also increase of prevalence of co-corresponding authors, practices that basically did not exist before the 2000s in the publishing world. And when you look at the retraction watch itself, around 5% of all articles have been retracted because of authorship dispute or affiliation issue, alongside some of the other issues on those papers. So what have journals done? And that's sort of a part of peer review, is they have now much stricter rules that they want to prevent any changes to the authorship list after submission of the papers, because they have also experienced that some authors sneakily add authors during the proofing stage, because at that stage, the editor will not know even what little changes have been done in proofs. And so sometimes the authors would add extra quotas during that stage, and the editorial office wouldn't be alerted to certain things. So many journals now don't ask them. One thing that I hope we will see is more journals asking authorship agreements. For those of you who don't know what authorship agreements, they are sort of starting documents of every research projects where authorship is agreed on the beginning, and what roles of researchers will do at the beginning of the project, including the list of their what will be on the final end of the paper. It doesn't seem that any of these can change during the research projects, because they can, but it at least allows transparency of what was planned, sort of like the protocols of the studies and the register reports of what was done. And then we actually come to the peer review. So let's say you passed all of these checks that some journals do and some don't, from authorship to ethics to conflicts of interest and everything else. And then the editors decide to send your paper to peer review. Now we have two most common types of journals. One that will send everything that falls into their scope for peer review, that they don't care about novelty, only of the methods of the paper. So the methods are good, they will send anything to peer review. And those journals that don't, which is the majority, because they have limited number of resources, and they're looking for prestige or novelty or even possible impact. So all the top journals will usually have rejection rates before they even send to peer review that are around 90% or even more, that papers are rejected before they're even sent. And then mega journals like PLOS or Scientific Reports will send almost all of the journals that fall into the scope and they're methodologically valid, will send for peer review. And, the things that I mentioned, some journals like ours had editorial peer review, full editorial peer review of for papers that happen even before being sent to external peer review. Now, the official definition of what peer review is that it's a quality control mechanism in scholarly research. And what I like to often sort of relate it to, ideally, if it works, it would be like checking if the food can be released for the public for consumption. Peer review is supposed to sort of be able to check if the information in the paper is safe to be released to the public for consumption. And of course, we know that it doesn't always work like that, because peer review cannot catch everything. And one of the reasons for that is that In most of the journals, we only have 2 external peer reviewers that review. Most of this work is done voluntary. There's only journals in finance and economics that actually pay reviewers upfront. They have something which is called journal submission fee, which authors often need to pay around $200 to just submit to the paper. And of those submission fee, $50 goes to each of the 2 reviewers, and around $100 goes to the journal for processing and finding those peer reviews. Now, this is very uncommon in any other fields than in finance and economics. In most other journals, the peer review is completely voluntary. And today's the peer review workbench of Elsevier that contains around 18 million records on peer review has shown that it takes a medium that in the first round of peer review, to secure those 2 external peer reviewers, editors need to invite around 7 reviewers to get those to accept. And this has increased in the last years. And majority of the reviewers accept or reject their invitations within the 9 days that the reviews have been invited. Based on survey data and some empirical research, reviewers spend on average 3 to 8 hours to produce their peer review reports. And median number of words per review report is somewhere between 350 to 400 words. Of course, these are large differences between scientific fields. In biomedical papers, which are usually up to 3,500 words, this definitely applies. But in some humanities papers and social papers, where papers can be 20 pages long or more, both the peer review and the review reports can be much longer. We have across the world, most commonly before called 3 types of peer review: single blind, double blind, and triple blind. From 2023, the new taxonomy has changed those terms to be single anonymized, double anonymized, or triple anonymized, and open peer review. Open peer review means that both the review reports are published with or without the name of the reviewers. Full open is often considered when the reviewer names are also published, and transparent peer review when only the review reports are published but not the names of the reviewers. Unfortunately, today in science, only less than 1% of all journals, and we mentioned before that there's almost 100,000 journals today in the world, use open peer review. So we don't know really what happens and how good or bad the peer reviews were of the papers themselves. Something that also has increased today, we have around 6% of all articles being pre-registered or having published protocols. And what is unknown is who should be reviewing what has changed from the protocol to that. Because when you ask a reviewer to do that task as well, you're giving him much more work than just reviewing the paper itself. And so in some journals, like ours previously, we would do this work for them. We would not ask reviewers to check the registration because it is extra work and it's hard to do it. And ideally, every paper that has a protocol should have a starting section in their methods that says changes from the registration or from the protocol, even if those changes are not there, to clearly state they are not there. But one of the changes that also we've often emphasized the need to be explained is changes to the authorship list, including any funding or declarations that happen not just to the paper and the findings itself. Where do editors find reviewers? That's a very tricky sort of question. You're supposed to know them from the field. You check papers that come out of that. Previously, you could check the Publons database because they sorted authors based on the fields that exist. But there are websites like Scholar GPS that list scholars in their disciplines and the sort of quality on their publications and citations. So you could also go from there. One of the things that is definitely missing across the research on peer review is knowing when the actual reviewers of the papers are those who are considered to be the top in their field versus, let's say, medium or, in a lower quartile or a lower experienced sort of journals. And this is what we don't know. Very little research has been done on who actually reviews and how good or how many publications they had before. And we could presume that there is an influence of the experience of both writing papers and reviewing them on the researcher's experience itself. One of the biggest randomized controlled trials ever done in peer review was the Nobel versus Novice study, where a Nobel laureate wrote a paper with his PhD student, and then this paper was sent to more than 800 reviewers around the world, of which 540 accepted. but one group was given the name that the paper was written only by the Nobel Prize winner. One group was given the name that it was written by a student. And the third group was not given the name of the authors and asked to evaluate the paper. And the review reports of those differed greatly based on did they know the name of the author, with 60%, 65% of reviewers rejecting the paper when they knew the student's name, and only 20% rejecting the paper when they knew that the Nobel Prize winner wrote it. So there are some possibly inherent biases in the peer review process that have nothing to do with the quality of work itself, but also the reputation of the author who is writing the paper. Now, I wasn't involved in the study, but I was a reviewer for it. And one thing that I was very much curious, and then we did now a research study with the authors of that original study, is to manually analyze all of those 540 reports to see what actually the reviewers were writing in them. And what was sort of a little bit disappointing for me is that even though this is a very long paper, this was a 50-page long paper in economics, so very different from my fields, only around 12% of reviewers mentioned directly something about data results. Majority of others were talked about style, about the references, about a little bit more in, expanding the introduction or theory section or discussion, but not having a clear statement of do they think that the results or the methods are good or reproducible or things. Only a few, and you can see that at the latest one, only 8 of these 500 people actually said that they couldn't reproduce a specific table from the paper itself. So there isn't really an expectation what we see, because this is sort of a natural experiment, that reviewers do this, and whether they will do it, it can take time. And so another research that we've done, and this is sort of my favorite currently, is we wanted to be able to estimate how much papers change because of peer review. And so we have summarized all of the studies that have ever looked at what has changed between a preprint and a published study, or between a submitted paper and a published study. And we have seen that only 2% of papers change in their conclusions. There's a lot of other changes, including, we talked about authorship before. Almost a quarter of the paper have changes in the authorship. Now, because these were studies that went from 1967 all the way to 2024, we believe this is because of those previous practices. We know today that a lot of publishers are making a stop to this, that authorships have changed during the paper. And I'm not saying that any authorship changes cannot happen. There are sometimes cases when reviewers ask for additional data or additional analysis that may warrant, recruiting extra people to do work. But on a majority of things, when most of the methods don't change and when the most analysis don't change, then we don't really think, based on these other numbers that you can see here, that there is sufficient proof to say that a lot of these authorship changes happen because really someone else needed to do the work. And what raises the question for me, this is, if only around 2 or even a little bit more change in their conclusions, but that still seems to be less than 5%, should we be then reviewing everything the way we do right now? Because during the pandemic, we have seen that the retractions of preprints have happened faster than the retractions of papers. And so if we are able to catch them at that stage, maybe we don't need to be reviewing everything in a full reviews, but the scientific community would catch up the biggest, the things that are not the best and that could be improved. And so one thing that I want to mention is we don't have evidence is single blind better than double blind, or is open better than any of those practices. And so it was already in 1999 that some of the journals said the only reason to choose one of the practices is ethical in what you sort of believe. And it was because of that they believed that the transparency of peer review trumps not being transparent. And so publishing peer review report can be helpful both for the readers of the articles and for the science itself, that we learn from what happens. So I hope that, more of you will be willing to write open peer review reports, or even analyze them when you're doing your papers. And then something also to say is there are questionable research practices that happen because of the peer review itself. Journals and some editors ask authors to cite their own work, to cite work of their sister journals, so that they increase the impact factors of those journals. We have seen people who make up personas and avatars so that they produce fake peer reviews. We have seen journals and editors boosting their own sort of publication practices, or even sometimes reviewers delaying the publications of someone else's work or stealing their ideas. And I think all of these practices can happen only when the system is closed. When the system is open and the reviewer's name and the editor's names are published, I think the reputation cost would be much, much higher to do this. And we see every year that already, since decades, Thomson Reuters, who publishes, and Claret, who publish the impact factor, the journal citation reports, every year they ban around 20 to 30, if not more, journals because of manipulation of the peer review process and the citations in those journals. And so we often, put all the blame on the authors and everything that they're doing, but it's not just them. It's because of the peer review practices that sometimes the editors and the journals do bad things. And because we often don't check the best quality of the references themselves, some studies, including systematic review published this year, says that authors themselves don't always correctly cite papers, and around 20% of references that they put have nothing to do with the claims that they made themselves. And this is where now more and more AIs are going into to be able to check these things. And if you look at maybe Cite AI, you can also see that almost 90% of all references are just to point towards those papers are related to it, but not specifically claiming they prove this or dispute the claim that you have. And another thing that happens behind closed doors is that some of the review comments can be quite offensive. And we classify offensive comments as those that attack the person and not the paper or the science behind the paper. So when they're, insult the gender or the countries of those individuals or even their intellect, those are the things that you want to avoid. And we have seen that in open peer review reports, people are more likely to write a little bit more polite reviews and reviews that are more suggestive to things. And I have to admit, as an editor that has worked in a journal that has open peer review, when I look at my peer review reports that I published 10 years ago, I'm not the best proud of them because I started in the old generation and we would be much more critical of, everything that was said. And today I realize that you can say the same criticism with a much nicer tone, which you can say, please consider doing this. Please, I suggest checking this or doing a different analysis to strengthen your results. So you can say the same criticism in a nicer tone when we are conscious of what that is. And I think that also will then make it more willing for the authors to sort of listen to you and amend their papers. And then the last thing that I want to talk about, because I think I'm going a little bit overboard, is the structured peer review. You have seen what happens when you don't tell and ask reviewers what to comment on papers. So one thing that we've been promoting for the last 2 or 3 years is that journals use structured peer review, meaning that that the reviewers are asked specific questions and that they comment on those questions. We have devised a list of 8 questions that are sort of applicable for typical biomedical or biological sciences. They may not apply to, mathematics, logics, or social science research always, or humanities, but those fields are developing their own questions. But I've seen as an editor, when you have these and when you have both reviewers commenting on the same things, then that the authors also satisfaction with the peer review is greater because they see that the both authors have addressed the same thing. And often we know that, which we call the fallacy of reviewer too, when you get one short review or sort of superficial review and then another review that is 10 pages long and they're not even talking about the same thing. And so what this sort of does is standardize the review report. It asks the same questions, and then we can talk about who agrees that these things should be changed, and do we have a consensus of what the results of those papers are. But the most important, I think, those questions are always, if you as a researcher would have done this study, would you have done it in the same way? Would you have analyzed it in the same way? And if and of course there could be a little bit differences in methods, what you have done but planned. But if this was what was done, would you have really analyzed it this way, or do you think something is better? And if that question is not answered, then a lot of these other things about adding extra things to introduction discussion don't really matter. Peer review quality should primarily be focused on, are the results trustworthy based on what was sort of done. And so we have shown that when you do this, the agreement between reviewers increases, and the agreement between reviewers, which I didn't mention before, is that it is only around 27%, meaning that it's lower than 50%. So it's basically a flip of a coin. The 2 reviewers think that a specific paper that they reviewed for a journal should be accepted for that journal. And that is not, I think, something that we want to be proud of as science. I think as science, we are working on consensus, and the majority of people should agree on the same things of whether or not this paper deserves to be published or its results are trustworthy. Unfortunately, a lot of people today think that the only way to really truly assess that is if we have access to the data and code, and to be able to reproduce those results. To be able to reproduce them can take quite a lot of time. And around 25% of journals today mention or recommend data sharing, but very few actually require it. And that's why, we have a lot of things. And yet the errors and retractions because of errors in data and replication of data are now increasing and are sort of one of the biggest things that we want to avoid. But there are exemplary examples, and this is where I'm going to end the talk today. There are journals that are replicating everything that they publish, and journals that have something which they call reproducible specialists, people who they hire to reproduce every graph and every figure and every number in those papers before they publish, so that he can say that from the data that was submitted, we can guarantee that this is what we call computational reproducibility, that we can get the same results. I think this will be hopefully the future of all scientific publishing, especially when the AIs make this much more much less expensive, and when we are able to do what a lot of scientists have told, one click computational reproducibility, that every figure, every number, and everything in the table can be sort of with one click reproduced by code, that you can show that it works. That doesn't, of course, mean that some bad actors won't be able to manipulate the data before that process, but there are ways to ensure that the raw data has not been manipulated if the institutions have a clear copy of where the raw data was saved before anyone had access to it to do any analysis on it. And I think I want to end there because I did a little bit longer than did. The only maybe last mention is as part of these, we have created a peer review toolkit with a lot of resources for peer reviewers and authors are, and I highly encourage you to go there. It's all free, that you check a little things that we've done on peer review. So apologies again for being a little bit long. I think you can see why I love peer review. I could talk for it probably for hours. So thank you again.